Hello, and welcome to another edition of Nifty Notions. I'm Jason.
And I'm Andrew.
And Andrew, you've traditionally had us in transport mode with your comments and things to date. What have you got for us this time?
Well, we're not venturing far from transport, but certainly engineering.
Okay.
Does the letter and numbers K129 mean anything to you?
K129. So I'm familiar with that in terms of mountain ranges,
Right.
K2, and I'm familiar the naming of stars as K something.
Okay.
Is there any that remotely?
No. What about, I'll throw a few words at you, the Cold War,
Yes.
Soviet nuclear submarines, Howard Hughes, CIA, and a lost submarine.
Conspiracy theory comes straight in there, and something with Howard Hughes is going to be really wacky.
Yes, the Tony Stark of the past, the original Tony Stark, Mr. Iron Man himself.
Yes, indeed.
So this is an interesting story. It's about a Russian nuclear submarine that went missing, supposedly carrying 3 intercontinental nuclear ballistic missiles at the time.
God.
It was K129 was its designation.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It was en route from Russian port. I'm going to put the name underneath because I can't pronounce it and can't remember it. But a Pacific Russian port on its way to do a patrol towards the USA.
Okay.
And obviously the missiles in there are targeted at the USA. So it was supposedly following a regular course. And it didn't respond to radio calls. And after about 3 weeks, the Russians declared it as a missing submarine. So they had no idea what had happened to it or where it was. And this is in March of 1968.
I've never heard this.
It's one of those weird little things you either have or you haven't.
Extraordinary.
So about early April, the American Navy noticed that there was an awful lot of surface Russian or Soviet, actually correctly called Soviet at that time, Soviet ships, submarines, aircraft patrolling in density over certain parts of the Pacific Ocean. We're talking about very remote parts of the Pacific Ocean between the Russian Pacific territory and, say, Midway.
Wow.
Okay. Very deep territory as well. This is sort of like 5,000 metres, 3 miles deep.
Yeah, big trenches.
So the Americans just watched and waited. And after a few weeks, about a month of searching, the Russians just took off home.
Did the Americans know what they were searching for?
They pretty much surmised, look, if it was a surface ship, they would have known there was a surface ship there.
Right.
If a plane had gone down, they would have known about it. It's the submarines that, that's where they would have thought, well, it's probably a submarine they're looking for. Right?
Okay.
So what America had at the time, which the Soviet Union didn't have, was underwater microphones. And these were there to actually try and pick up the acoustic signature of missiles being fired, torpedoes being fired, also of Russian ship movements and Russian submarine movements. The Soviets didn't have that, but the Americans did.
Interesting.
So what the Americans did was they went back over their acoustic sound records for various microphones in that part of the Pacific. And on the 8th of March 1968, or if you're in America, that's March 8, 1968, they did pick up a little rumble, and they sort of assumed that rumble was an implosion of a submarine.
Wow.
And through triangulation of all these different microphones, they worked out a 5 square mile area where this was most likely located.
That's pretty precise in a big ocean.
Yeah, but triangulation, you can do that. Where you work out, I've got a certain strength of signal at this point, and a certain strength of signal at this point, and a certain strength of signal at this point, and you can just kind of work out, well, with where the peak signal's coming from, and it's kind of in the area where all these signals intersect. Okay. So not too difficult. It's done often with navigation and with all sorts of other measurement methods. So about a year later, the Americans had sent a submarine, a specially equipped submarine with towing what they called a fish, which was a sonar, depth sounder, and it had lights and it had cameras into this area to crisscross the bottom of the ocean and take photos and sonar soundings of the ocean in this 5 square mile area.
I see.
And they came back with 20,000 photos.
Good God.
Many of them were of the submarine. They'd actually located the submarine, and they
Wow.
figured the Russians had no idea where this submarine was because their search area wasn't anywhere near this.
And they'd stop looking.
And they'd stopped looking. So in the aftermath of this, the Americans thought this would be an absolute information coup if they could recover this submarine, because they could learn about the technology that the Russians were using, the level of technology. Was it as good as the Americans? Was it better? Was it worse? They could find possibly code books, so they could break codes. And also they could render safe some nuclear missiles and nuclear torpedoes.
Yes.
That was the idea.
Wow.
So Project Azorian was born.
Azorian.
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 Azorian. Or if you're American, it's Azorian.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So Project Azorian was born. Now this was kept in the utmost secrecy. The Navy were not involved because the Navy obviously had the equipment, but they also had a lot of people.
So who's in charge?
The CIA.
Right.
And this went all the way up to President Nixon with his approval. And they needed some sort of cover story and some sort of way of going to this sub and recovering what they wanted to recover. Originally, the idea was to go down there and to recover parts or bits of information, but they realised that was just very difficult at those depths. They just didn't have the technology for that. So they came up with the idea of snatching the whole sub.
Snatching a sub that's buried deep down.
5,000 metres below the ocean in one of the roughest parts of the Pacific Ocean.
How do you do that?
This is where Howard Hughes comes in.
Oh,
The original Tony Stark.
yes.
So
He would love this sort of
he
thing.
would love this sort of thing. For those that don't know who Howard Hughes was, he was an inventor, a philanthropist, a multi-billionaire, a movie mogul from the 1930s all the way through the 70s.
He had one of the biggest airlines, TWA.
That's right. Yeah, he did have TWA as well. So Howard Hughes was a very clever man, an engineer.
Yeah.
He was born into a very wealthy family, but he made even more out of it.
Yeah. Very odd man.
Very eccentric man, absolutely. And there was a film that was made about him with Cate Blanchett and Leonardo DiCaprio.
Right.
And plenty of other movies about Howard Hughes. But anyway, he had the funds, the knowledge to be able to do this sort of thing. So he stepped in and said, well, I don't really want to be involved in this, but you can use the cover of my companies, because he had exploration companies.
Yes.
And you can use some of my selected staff who are vetted for secrecy and so forth. So there were very few people in the CIA, nobody in the Navy, no one in the military in the USA who knew about this, and very few people in the White House even knew about this.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Very extraordinary. So what they had decided to do was to build a ship that could go out to this part of the world and to lift up this submarine. So how do you do that? I mean, it's an engineering feat in itself to try and lift up.
It's a big ship.
Yeah, something that's several thousand tons, 5,000 metres below. I mean, I'm thinking as an engineer, like the stresses and strains required of either cables or pipes or whatever it is that you're using, plus trying to lift something like this out of the mud or whatever is in the sea surface, because there's always going to be this suction underneath there. They came up with an idea of building a ship that had a moon pool in it. So essentially a big bathtub with doors at the bottom that would open it to the ocean, and they would then lower a grabbing mechanism to the bottom of the ocean, grab the sub and lift it up like a claw. So
5,000 metres worth of cable just to get down there.
Well, they thought of cable originally, but cable just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Too elastic, can sway too much because they need absolute accuracy in their sort of movements. They came up with pipes. So this is like oil drilling pipes. If you've ever seen an oil drilling rig where they join pipes together and they can go down, and at the end of the pipe they've got the heavy drilling mechanisms and they can bring it back. So the ship was going to be essentially look like a drilling rig, an offshore drilling rig type of or an exploring type of ship.
Yeah.
They called the ship the Glomar Explorer. And this ship, through the design phase, they realised initially that it was far too small for what they were doing. So they had to make it really wide because originally they were trying to get it through the Panama Canal because it was being built in Connecticut.
Oh, right.
And they needed to get it into the Pacific. And it's a lot nicer to just go through the Panama Canal than to go around the bottom of South America, which is very rough seas indeed. But they had to widen the ship. They had to lengthen the ship for design reasons, for rigidity, because when the bottom of this ship opened up, there were only two narrow things holding the front of the ship and the back of the ship together, and in the oceans out there, that probably wouldn't be enough to sustain the viability of that ship. So it had to get much bigger. And there's a picture of the Glomar Explorer. Now, they needed a cover story for this. And the cover story was manganese nodule mining from the bottom of the ocean.
I knew you were going to say that. Not.
Don't ask me to say it again. But the cover story was, and they'd done plenty of press releases, that the Hughes Corporation, so Howard Hughes was lending his name to all of this, the Hughes Corporation was going to go and try some manganese nodule mining from the bottom of the ocean, using the Glomar Explorer, and if anyone could get away with this story, Howard Hughes could.
Because he was so eccentric and he had his fingers in everything.
Everything. And he tried all sorts of things and made lots of money doing all sorts of things.
That makes it perfect cover, isn't it?
It does.
And you wouldn't think he'd be working with the US government.
Well, he did a lot of work with the US government, but yeah,
You wouldn't think that.
No, back in the
his own
60s,
thing.
through the Second World War, he did a lot of work with the US government with designing planes and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, at this time, in the late 60s, early 70s, he's an old eccentric man with a lot of money. So it did take quite a few years to build this ship. So this submarine's sitting there for years and years and years, and the Americans are making sure that the Russians aren't going anywhere near it, and they're keeping their distance from it to not draw any attention to it. And finally, in early 1974, the ship did move from the shipyards and went round into the Pacific, and it docked at Long Beach in California.
Right.
And they had a change of crew because the crew that brought it around thought they were just part of the testing crew, which they were.
Right.
But everybody was under the impression that these people are going out to do some manganese nodule mining. But that crew was let go, and they loaded the ship up with several bits and pieces that were needed for this extraction. And they also had a whole lot of CIA people on board the ship.
Absolutely.
And what they also built was a submersible barge. Now, Lockheed, many companies were used to build different components of this ship for the recovery effort, and none of them knew what they were doing, what they were building. There was always a cover story.
Yep.
Lockheed, the aircraft company and the ballistic missile company, was contracted to build the big gripping mechanism. They didn't know what it was for. They were just contracted to do this, and it was shipped to a hangar, or not a hangar, a port. What would you call it? Something like a hangar. Over the
big warehouse.
Warehouse kind of thing on the port in the bay, and this mechanism was then lifted into this barge with a cover over the top, and under the cover of night, the barge was slowly moved out from this cover, submerged, and moved underneath the Glomar Explorer.
Wow.
The doors were opened up, and this gripping mechanism was then lifted into the bottom of the ship. Doors closed, barge submerged, moved back, and then refloated further away.
This is a James Bond movie.
Oh, it's incredible.
It's
got all of this stuff going for it. So
Cold War, it's a perfect Bond.
There's an example of what some of the mechanism looked like.
Wow.
Okay, so they had this gripping mechanism with 5 fingers on one side and 3 fingers on another. And one of the other things that happened that the CIA managed to get from all those photos in their reconnaissance back in 1969 was they made a model of the ship, of the submarine in the bottom of the ocean, and they were able to, with that, design the gripper mechanism to pick this thing up in one go.
Okay.
So, because it was leaning over it on its side, and you can see the photo of that on the screen, there were 5 fingers on one side and 5 grippers on one side and 3 grippers on the other side.
Wow.
So it was all asymmetrical. Now, when they get to the site, which happened around July 1974.
This is 6 years after this thing went
Well, it took
missing.
long. They had to build this ship specially for it. This was not a modified ship. This was built specially for the job.
Yeah. The slow war Cold War.
Yes, exactly. So they positioned themselves over the top, and while they were doing that, there was some, because they were there for about a month, and some Soviet vessels had come around and got very close, and some Soviet planes were, and they were just checking out what the hell's going on here, who are these people, but eventually left them alone. So they weren't any wiser to what was going on. And that's a picture of, imagine there's 5,000 metres in between those two items, trying to grip that that submarine.
Wow.
Now, when the gripper hit the ocean floor, and it was bang on, by the way, it was perfect alignment.
Gosh.
As they closed the gripping mechanism, it couldn't close completely because they didn't really know what the sediment at the bottom would be like. It was much denser than they thought, and the gripping mechanism was not strong enough to break through or to be able to grip the submarine completely. So 3 of the gripping arms had been slightly fractured in the process.
Right.
So then they started lifting, okay? And I think they got about 1,000 metres away from, so it's 5,000 metres below, but they got up about 4,000 metres, so they're about 1,000 metres from the surface. And the submarine shifted, and those gripping arms that were fractured failed completely, and 2/3 of the submarine snapped off and went back to the bottom.
2/3 of it?
2/3 of it, which had the conning tower, which is where the missiles were.
Right.
They grabbed basically the front of the submarine, managed to pull it into the moon, the moon pool, close the doors, and then head back to Long Beach.
Wow.
Now, there's very little knowledge or information about what actually happened to all the different bits. What I have read about it is that on the way back, they had experts looking at it, seeing if anything was radioactive. They did recover 6 bodies from the 6 Russian sailors' bodies, and they buried them at sea on the way back.
Okay.
And they filmed all of this, and they played the Russian national anthem, or whatever was the Soviet national anthem at the time. And only after about 1992, after Yeltsin actually became the first elected president of Russia, or what was the USSR still, did the Americans actually give them information about this in an effort for diplomacy, and they gave them videotape of the burial at sea.
Yes.
Okay. They didn't give the sub back though.
Of course not.
And so it's said that they did cut off bits of the submarine on the way back that were of no consequence and turf them in the ocean because they wanted to have minimal evidence when they got back. They would have loved to have had a whole submarine, but they had bits of submarine they didn't need.
Yeah,
so,
and they knew the good bits, didn't they?
Yeah, they didn't get any of the missiles, but they did get, I believe, 3 nuclear-tipped torpedoes.
Wow.
So that was there. And they did, when they brought it back into Long Beach, it was the same deal with that barge. In the middle of the night, the barge is submerged, it slides underneath the ship drops the load into the barge, and then the barge goes undercover, and whatever happened. It's very hard to know what happened to all these bits and pieces. Now, they had planned to go back a year later because there was only this window where the seas were calmest around the June-July period. So they had planned to go back. They'd repaired the gripper using different materials because apparently the materials they used were very strong but very brittle, and they decided to have softer metal that would be more bendy and be able to take the stress.
I see.
So a little bit more ductile steel.
Wow.
But what had happened in the meantime is one of Hughes's offices had been broken into and some information had been stolen. And because they were worried about this, the CIA had then started talking to the FBI, who talked to the Los Angeles Police Department, saying, this is really critical information, we need to keep this under wraps. Someone in the police department leaked to someone in the media. The New York Times had already got wind of this story, and the CIA had managed to say, please do not publish this, we want to go back and get the rest of the sub. But someone at the LA Times had not got that message and published the story, and it was out, and that was the end of that. So they didn't go back.
The publishing of the story was about the breaking in of Hughes's office?
No, it was about
what they found.
Yes, no, it was about this whole Project Azorian.
Right.
So it had all just cascaded, and information had then leaked out.
Yeah.
So they abandoned going back. Eventually, they told the Russians where the nuclear sub was, and you can see that if you look that up, you'll know exactly the coordinates of it if you want to go visit it by any chance.
So the Russians didn't retrieve it?
No.
So it's still there?
It's still there. So it's still there. Now, the Glomar Explorer, was pretty much, well, it was a one sort of
It's a one-trick pony.
one-trick pony. It sat dormant for about 2 decades. But then
Next to Hughes's aircrafts, no doubt.
well, yeah, the Spruce Goose.
Spruce Goose, yeah.
In Long Beach. An exploration company then bought the ship because they thought, well, it actually is good for deep sea exploration and we might use it. And they used it for a while, and then ultimately, that was from about the early 2000s. They purchased the ship, refitted it.
Okay.
And then it was used, but not successfully. And in 2015, it was sold to a Chinese company and scrapped.
Wow.
So that's the story of the Glomar Explorer and of K129, a story that many, many people have not heard about.
And I'm one of those. And it's extraordinary how I know anything about this, given its significance in the Cold War, with Howard Hughes, with the Russians, with the Americans. That is an extraordinary story.
It is amazing how they're able to keep this so secret for so long.
Yeah. Incredible. Well, thank you for that story. That is
Amazing.
really, really interesting.
Excellent.
And that's it for this episode of Nifty Notions. I'm Jason.
And I'm Andrew.
And if you like what you heard, feel free to like and subscribe. And until next time we see each other, it's so long.
See ya.